Hello, everyone. Welcome back. You are tuned in and listening to The Student Pilot. So, today's video is going to be a podcast style about the private pilot license flight test ground portion. This video is a bit longer than my usual content, so that's why I've decided to go with the podcast style. I hope you guys like this or maybe want more of this. If you have any comments, questions, or advice to share about the ground, please leave it down below. Today's video really is just sharing some advice on what I experienced on my ground. It's not meant to be like any sort of nitpicking space. It's not a guide that you should follow to the T. That's what Transport Canada is there for. But should rather supplement the learning that you have going on, the preparations you are currently doing. So with that out of the way, I want to jump into the agenda for today. So first, we have the expectations of the PPL ground. Second, what are you exactly bringing to it? Next, we'll be jumping into the weather briefing, the route preparations, weight and balance, and takeoff and landing distances. All right, so to start, we have the expectations. Well, the expectation for the PPL ground is that you actually need to pass. Okay, so if you do fail, you have to redo the entire ground. You don't actually even move on to the flight portion. The understanding there is, right, if you don't know what you're talking about, if you don't know the plane that you're flying, of course you're not going to go on to fly the aircraft. So a lot of students are usually scared about this part, myself included. It's really daunting because it seems like there is a lot to know, but understand that you are private pilot license level, and you technically won't know everything to a commercial pilot's license level because you're not there yet, right? So first, you don't need to memorize everything. You don't have to know everything that's in the POH. It's impossible. And second, you have the POH to read, right? So let's just be a little bit more logical about it. So don't feel like you need to commit every single thing you read to memory in the POH, or it's kind of impossible, but you should understand the basics, the fundamentals of the aircraft that you're flying, its systems. You should know what kind of fuel do you need for your aircraft, or how do you read a CFS, or how do you decode it, really. Those are the kind of things that you are expected to know, because with this license, you're going to be flying by yourself on long cross countries and trips and whatnot, right? So the expectation is that you do pass, and you don't need to memorize everything in order to pass. So what are you bringing to this ground? If you don't need to memorize everything, well, you can bring your own binder of notes, right? It's like a flight test binder. So you can have notes from the POH in there, your CFSs to supplement your route preparations. You can bring in diagrams about the systems in your aircraft. And remember, you can mark these things up. You shouldn't be writing on full-on paragraph answers, of course, but you can make a couple mnemonics, acronyms, or keywords to remind you of definitions that don't readily come to your mind, right? Don't fill it up with things you already know. Really try to put in stuff that you are kind of iffy about or have a hard time remembering, I should say. Don't pull up with the flight test notes book with answers and read off of it. That's not what the ground is about. You're going to leave with a bad impression on your examiner. So just try to make a good impression. Come in with a binder of notes that you may have, your VNC, your CX3 or E6B, chart ruler, square protractor, those kind of basic things that you would need to also, of course, take on your flight, like your nav logs and stuff, right? I did bring a binder to my ground, but I didn't use it. I'm not a brainiac to remember everything, so that's not the reason why I didn't use my binder. I actually used my iPad. I found that my iPad was just a bit more useful. So if you do have one and you are actively using it for your training, like let's say you use it for flight or something, or to pull up stuff in the CFS, or right, I found it much more easier to bookmark pages in the CFS rather than printing out those papers. I felt more overwhelmed, a bit more anxious when it came to flipping through all these papers looking for the answer versus searching it up in the CFS, keywords. So much more easier. was much like less stressful. Like, what if I didn't print out a paper that I needed? What if that one page that I was looking for wasn't in my flight test notes binder? I would actually be sent over the edge. So the iPad method was really useful for me, very helpful. I even asked my examiner, though, before we started, I asked them if it was okay that I was using my iPad, and they were completely fine with it. So even if it's like unconventional or not like non-traditional, like people don't really come in with their iPad, don't feel like you can't. If that's what works for you, just do it. If you feel like you don't need your binder to be filled with like 50 pages, but like your friend has that, you don't need to do that, right? That's what works for them. Don't feel like you need to go with the grain. But yeah, that's basically what I would say. Just bring in your VNC, bring in your nav logs, those stuff that you actually have to bring for your route, and consider bringing in a flight test binder of notes or your iPad that's already bookmarked with stuff. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, we're going to start with what your ground actually looks like. When you start your PPL ground, you're going to begin with a weather briefing. The examiner wants to know whether today's flight test is going to be a go or a no-go and why, based on the weather. Let's start with that, right? So for the weather briefing, some of the basic things you want to do, of course, is look at the bigger picture, right? Start with your GFAs, your TAF, and then your METARs. What I did was I took the GFAs, because I was working off of my iPad, I took screenshots of the GFA the night before and then the GFA the morning of, because my flight test was like, my ground was beginning around like 10. So the morning of, I looked at the GFA as well. I drew my route on the GFA and I highlighted it. And the reason I did that is because I want to show the systems and the weather that my route is going to be passing through, and I can actually show that to the examiner. Here, see, like this is what is going to happen if we do fly this route. And I took notes, right? I highlighted, okay, there's TCUs, or it's 5 statute miles, or there's light rain showers. I kind of wrote all of that out. I also took a screenshot because I had access to ForeFlight of the radar, what the radar would look like the night before versus the morning of, what the radar actually looked like for the route that we were going to fly. Also made sure to pay attention to the actual low or high pressure system that we're going to pass through, as well if freezing levels, right? If all of that was a concern, made sure to point that out as well as the prevailing upper winds. So that's kind of what I did in basic, but when I actually was speaking to the examiner, I actually made sure to know exactly what I was talking about. I spoke to FIC before I stepped foot into that briefing room. So I called FIC the morning of and asked them for a weather briefing for the route that I was quote unquote going to fly and around what time, right? And FIC told me the inside scoop, we should say, like what is the systems, but also what is the weather, what can you anticipate, what should you look out for, how are the winds, how are they going to change. All of this I made sure to take note of while they were talking to me, and then I said that to the examiner. I made sure that I said anything that made sense to me, right? I made sure that whatever I told the examiner, I had more knowledge on from my own accord. Like, I'm not just regurgitating, verbal diarrheaing everything out to the examiner. So that's pretty much what the weather briefing looked like. I have attached files below for you to reference. It's just an example of what you can see what I actually presented for my ground. And some of the stuff because I had access to ForeFlight, I was able to get a couple more resources. So aside from calling FIC and looking at the GFA, the TAFs, and the METARs, I also made sure to show whether we had a headwind or a tailwind for our flight. I also extracted the METARs, the TAFs, and looked at NOTAMs for the departure, destination, and en route airports. I didn't put together those couple pages by myself. I actually went through ForeFlight. So if you have ForeFlight, listen up. What you can do is you can put in the route that you need for your flight test. You can put that in ForeFlight. You can click the share button and send it to flights. And once it sends it to flights, you can click a button that says weather briefing, and it will propagate or populate your screen with all the NOTAMs and TAFs and the METARs that are prevalent for your route. and you're just going to comb through it, right? Just peruse and highlight what seems important or can be important for your route. That's it. That's the weather briefing. Okay. So if you have any sort of tips, advice, or questions, of course, go ahead and ask. But the weather briefing, pretty simple, pretty straightforward for the most part. All right, so now we're just going to move on to the actual route preparation. So if you don't have your ground scheduled yet, you don't have your route yet, like where do you start, right? So you're going to get your route. So for me, I had London, Lake Simcoe, Peterborough to Kingston, and I received it the day before. I think it's exactly like 24 hours before, something roughly around then. And I basically had to plan out the route, right? You had to consider anything and everything for this route. So what I started with was pulling out my VNC, putting down my route, drew the drift lines, drew my 10 nautical mile lines along the route, and then identified any obstacles along the way. How tall are these obstacles? Do I need to navigate around them? And I also highlighted my alternate aerodromes. So these alternate aerodromes are basically in the case of an emergency, or maybe the weather's looking bad, where would I divert to? And all I did was take down the name of these aerodromes, or like even if it's like a grass strip, like I just wrote down the name, and I also wrote down the frequency, mandatory, ATF, uncontrolled, whatever, right? Just wrote it down. That's where I started, plotting everything down, and then identifying obstacles and alternates. Then, of course, I got started on my navlog. When it comes to your navlog, right, you want to be able to understand where every single value that you are putting on that navlog, you know where it comes from. Nothing should be, poof, out of thin air. You just know that the fuel consumption rate in cruise is 5.4. Like, why is it 5.4? What chart did you look at to determine that? Or if you're going to say there's a crosswind, you didn't just plug it into a calculator. You are using a graph, a performance chart, to actually show where these numbers are coming from. Your true airspeed, what RPM setting are you going to be at? All of these things, you don't just guess or use it from your previous navlog, okay? They're going to ask you where you got these numbers from. Even if it's not, if you don't have it in front of you, the examiner will actually now be curious and they will dig. But if you at least show them that you had these performance charts that you marked up, and and you are intentional with everything on your navlog, you're not going to have a problem. Okay. What they're really looking for is, where everything comes from. You got your fuel consumption, you reserve fuel that you'll need, and the time en route, observation points, right? All those stuff. So once you fill out your navlog and you have everything down, the next thing I'd like to do is also take a look at the CFS for my departure en route destination aerodromes. Now, the CFS, or the Canada Flight Supplement, you can purchase it as a book. Maybe your instructor told you to buy the book, or if you have a 4-flight subscription available and you have access to the CFS there, I would just use that. I wouldn't buy the book because the CFS expires every couple of months, like almost like every 2 months. And if you buy the CFS book, it actually tells you the date and time right on the cover. So I just stick to the subscription. I wouldn't buy it if you don't have to. But in the CFS, for, let's say, I'm going to look at London. So I'm just looking at the London CFS right now. It has a lot of information on it, but not all the information always makes sense. So in order to decode the CFS, in the beginning of the book, there are a couple of pages that actually break down what some of these numbers or letters mean. For example, you have the London CFS that I'm looking at. In that first line where it says reference, it has your lat and long coordinates, but it also shows you things like, of course, the elevation, but what low chart are we looking at when you want to look at the London CFS? Or for public facilities, it says A-1236. What does that mean? You would know this I'm going to give this as a task for you. You're going to know this by actually looking at the public facilities list that is earlier in the CFS. There's also the services that are offered. So under services, there's one heading that says S and then says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you go into the earlier sections of the CFS, specifically page 66, according to what I have on ForeFlight, you can see S stands for servicing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, 1 stands for storage available, 2 is servicing minor repairs, 3 is major repairs, 4 is parking, and 5 is tie-down facilities, right? So all of these numbers, they correlate to something, and your examiner might ask you, well, okay, you're landing in Kingston. Are there facilities for parking, right? Or maybe you, let's say, you want to know if there's fuel available. Well, is there 100 low lead available, right? Just like questions like that you need to be able to answer that. For public facilities, I'm gonna spoil it for you. They also list out all of what the letters and the numbers mean. So A means the facilities are available in the terminal building, and A 1, 2, 3, 4, for example, 1 means telephone, 2 means food, 3 means taxi, 4 means medical facilities. What I did was I bookmarked these pages on my iPad, and when I had to refer to the CFS to answer any of these questions, I pulled up the CFS and I looked at this bookmarked page and I just went back and forth. And was like, yep, there is public Wi-Fi. Yep, there is car rental. That's it. So when it comes to reading the CFS, you should be able to really decode it and find out what is available at these specific airports. And when you are looking at the CFS for each of these locations, you need to pay attention to the procedures. What kind of circuits are being done? Right-hand circuits for specific runways. Maybe you can't make a turn above a certain height, or I should say below a certain height, sorry. Maybe there's a specific time of a couple months that there's maintenance being done, or there's the crane at the end of the runway during the summer season only. You need to look at the procedures section to catch these details, because when you are talking about joining procedures on your route, you need to also be aware of this. So once you have your route figured out, you have your nav logs done, you've decoded the CFS, you need to fill out your flight plan, the ICAO flight plan, right? So you need to be able to walk through each of the blanks that you fill out, and you have to know what are you actually putting into these blanks. So for the equipment available on board, like the type of flight, these kind of things you should be able to let your examiner know. And if you don't actually know, let's say, the mode of equipment that you have on board, go into the CFS. The CFS breaks down each of the blanks that you would need to fill out. And I would suggest you either bookmark it or you print out that page to bring into your flight test ground brief. Next, you want to actually focus on your route, right? So when you're looking at your route, you need to figure out the frequencies. Departure, en route, destination frequencies, ATF, MF, and if you need to, flight following. What kind of frequencies are you going to be using? Do you need to use the visual terminal area chart for the frequencies there? Or VTA, I should say, visual terminal area, VFR terminal area chart, the VTA. Would you need to use that for frequencies? So you can buy the VTA chart map, or you can also, once again, actually access that with the CFS. At least I think it's like one of the last, like the latter half of the book, latter quarter of the book, where it just has a bunch of maps of different areas around like different regions in Canada and the frequencies that they use for a specific area. Maybe it's like a practice area frequency in a specific part that you might have to transit through. So what frequency would everyone be on, right? So frequencies, very important. and you can look through the CFS, look through the VTA, and make a list, make like a succession, a list of frequencies that you would keep transferring to as you are going through this route. That would be the easiest way. So first you start on ground, then you go on to the tower, and then you're going to switch to en route. Then you need to go on to, like, for example, for me it would be like London radio to let them know my wheels up time, and then I would switch to en route frequency, or maybe I want flight following. So if you just write all the frequencies in order, you can tell the examiner, hey, like, these are all the frequencies I would use, this is that, and it's in order. So while I'm flying, I would be able to switch from one frequency to another, right? Then my next point is joining procedures. When you are arriving at each of these places, what would the joining procedure look like? Are you doing a teardrop? Are you just joining mid-left downwind from dead to active side? And what is the circuit altitude? Are there turns you should not be making below a certain altitude? And an other important thing that I would do is mark your go, no-go point for these airdromes. So maybe for your home airdrome or airport, like, you have a certain point where you should have achieved full power and rotate your aircraft, right? When you're at a new place, what is that point? It's an arbitrary point, right? There's no actual place, but what is the point where you would abort takeoff because it is no longer safe? You need to mark that down and also show to the examiner that you have considered this. You should also consider fuel stops. When would you need a fuel stop? If you are making a fuel stop, is it available on the CFS, like 100 low lead, right? You need to consider that. And you also need to be able to argue your altitude. What is your cruising altitude? Why is that your cruising altitude? Would that be faster in terms of airspeed, or would that be slower? I feel like you know the answer there. Well, like, are you avoiding obstacles? Are you avoiding an airspace? Would this give you clearance from a certain thing, right? That all should be considered for your altitude. Why are you choosing the altitude that you have chosen? Next would be winds. Are you having a tailwind or a headwind based on that weather briefing? And you need to consider MOAs. So MOAs specifically, they stand for Military Operations Area. They're usually like non-hazardous military flight activities happen, and they could be like training activities or like maneuvers and stuff. You can find more about this in the designated handbook, airspace handbook, if it's prevalent for your route. That's just something for you to know. You could technically transit through it, but it's just to separate military activities from any sort of IFR traffic that's happening. But yeah, is there an MOA, right? Those are the kind of things you need to consider now when it's looking at your route itself. So frequencies, no-go, go points, fuel stops, your winds, if there's an MOA, are you doing any wind corrections? And yeah, but those are the kind of things. So if there's anything I missed, of course, go ahead, leave that down below. But those are just some of the things that you should be considering on your route. Make it colorful. Use those expensive erasable highlighters and mark up your VNC, your nav logs, your CFSs and whatnot, okay? But that's really it for the route part of the ground. So the next thing you would want to think about is systems. So systems of your aircraft. TC mentions that you need to know, the guide mentions you need to know about the engine, the fuel, oil, brakes, and electrical systems. You don't need to know the absolute nitty gritty, but having the diagram, if your flight center, flight school offers it, having that diagram and marking it up would be extremely helpful. And just knowing, what kind of fluids these systems might consume, or special like effects that might happen, like a Venturi effect, or how does the parking brake work, like the type of engine, the max and min temperatures, max and min fluids in the system, right? So these are just some of the things you can know, or like the volts and the amps for your battery versus your generator. Like how much time do you have if something fails in one of these systems? Like stuff like that. I feel like your flight school is a bit more specific for this, but you have to know the systems and just mark up your diagrams. I feel like that's the best I can say. One helpful tip might be to create a script or like notes that you keep running through and you become so consistent with that when you are actually teaching someone the system or you're talking about the system, you have these certain number of points or a script that you are sticking to. So it comes to you much easier and it's not as complicated, to say the least. Next, for your ground, you should also prepare to answer an emergency, because they can ask an emergency on the ground at any time, as well as one while you're in the air or while taxiing. I was asked an emergency while I was during my ground brief, and mine was the electrical system failure. And in the air, it was rough engine for me. But for the electrical system failure, right, I sat there and I thought about it. I was like, okay, like it would be the flaps, it would be the trim, it would be the display. Like my lights, like, I said these things, and then my examiner was like, okay, yeah, that's correct, but next time pull out the checklist. So it's good if you know your emergencies off the top of your head, but remember, that's not actually what they want. They want you to pull out the checklist and use that. So maybe that's like the only time where you can just stare down at like a list of some sort as well and just say exactly what you see on the checklist. But that's something I remember the examiner was like, next time just pull out your checklist. I'm like, okay, sorry. Right? And finally, the last two things I want to talk about today is weight imbalance and takeoff landing distances. So for your weight imbalance, I'm not going to talk about how to calculate anything, but the one thing I do need you to consider is that when your examiner tells you that the passenger that is X weight is bringing max weight of baggage, remember, you need to consider fuel, right? Hypothetically, you are traveling with full fuel each time. Or when you refuel, how can you ensure that you are not outside that envelope of center of gravity, or you're not exceeding the max takeoff weight? So that's where you need to actually consider, are you reducing the amount of fuel that you're taking, or are you reducing the amount of baggage that you're allowing? And if you choose one or the other, feel like there is, hopefully you guys see the answer there. You need to consider your baggage, right? When you do your own weight imbalance for your flights, for your instructional flights, right? You also hopefully add some number of pounds, right, for the weight of baggage that you're bringing. So similarly, for this flight that you're planning the weight imbalance for, consider your own baggage. So let's say you're telling the passenger the max is 44 pounds. Hey, you can only bring 30 pounds. Well, maybe you as a pilot, as PIC is bringing 5. Well, now the passenger can only bring 25. So now you get to bring 5. Does that make sense? So that's one thing you need to consider for weight imbalance. And really, for takeoff and landing distances, it's not much, but this is where I messed up. I did my takeoff landing distances on the performance chart as I should, but I calculated my distances for no obstacle. Remember, you're going to be doing specialty takeoffs and landings on your flight test, and so to kind of simulate that same environment that's going to happen, you need to plan this graph or do this graph with a 50-foot obstacle. So I'm being so transparent, I did not do that. So I had to do it in front of the examiner, and I did it wrong the first time, and then I did it right, because both the examiner and I looked at my work and we just stared at it for maybe 3-4 seconds in silence, and they were like, does that look right? And I just remember being like, nope. And then I did it again. So to avoid that, remember, include that 50-foot obstacle, okay? And that's about it. That's your ground. So in terms of your weather briefing, main takeaway, call FIC, route preparations. There's a lot that you need to look after, but you need to basically know what every single value on your navlog, CFS, and flight plan is, and you need to consider alternates. You need to consider airspaces, frequencies. That's for your route, weight imbalance. Don't forget your own baggage, takeoff and landing distances. Don't forget the 50-foot obstacle. All right. So that's all I got for you guys today for the ground portion of your flight test. I said a lot of stuff This was, like I said, a super long video, or podcast, I should say, but that's exactly why it was just a podcast. So I hope you guys enjoyed. You learned something new. If you have any tips that your instructor has told you or you've heard from a friend, please leave it down below. Share with the public, let's help each other out. And I really hope that you guys do well on your ground for your PPL, whatever you may be working for. Any comments, questions, advice, leave it down below. I'll try my best to answer it, or maybe someone else can also answer it for me. I'm sure there's a lot of people getting ready for their flight tests with the summer finally here with us. But yeah, thank you everyone for listening. You are tuned in and listening to The Student Pilot. I will see all of you guys next time. Bye.